Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. How names were meant to last forever. There is something sacred about a name in ancient Egypt. It was more than identification, it was endurance. A name spoken was a life remembered. A name carved was a life immortal. To chisel it into stone was to place it into the cycle of eternity. The Nile might flood, dynasties might rise and fall, but the name etched deep and precise could outlast them all. And so the scribes of Egypt followed strict rules. Every pharaoh's cartouche had its protocols. First came the titulary, Horus name, Neti name, Golden Horus, throne name, birth name. These were not vanity titles. They were formulae, cantations of power that confirmed the ruler's place in the cosmos. The scribe, in this system, was not just a bureaucrat or an artist. He was a guardian of continuity, midwife to eternity, which is what made the scribe in year 5 of Akhenaten's reign pause. He sat in a new capital Akhenaten, a horizon of the Aten, a strange place, built fast. Walls still wet with paint, streets too wide for shade. No temples to aim in, no priests in white linen trailing incense through dim corridors, just flat-roofed stone buildings, and everywhere those golden sun rays stretching down in carved reliefs from the disk above, touching the faces of Akhenaten and his family. The Aten, the only god now permitted. The scribe's name has been lost, but his moment of hesitation survived. He had been assigned a new stealer, a boundary marker near the cliffs. His job was to carve the royal declaration, outlining the sacred boundaries of Akhenaten. This was a routine duty, and yet he paused when he reached the name of the king. The name he was told to write was not like the others. No Horus name in full, no mention of Amun-Re, just Akhenaten, the effective name of the king since its change from Amenhotep IV. And more startling, Tat was to be written in a new way, not as the traditional solar disk representing Ra with falcon or cartouche. Now it was a bare circle with extending rays ending in human hands. No anthropomorphic god, no animal-headed deity, just a disk, an abstract, an ideal. What was a name to a god who had no face? The scribe shifted his weight on the rock ledge, chisel in hand. Behind him, the cliffs stretched upward in the dry silence of Middle Egypt. Below, the floodplain shimmered in the late sun. Dust coated his tunic. Flies hovered near his inkpot. But still, he paused, because what he was about to do broke the rules. To inscribe the king's name was to validate his divinity. To omit the old gods was to deny their existence. And to inscribe the Aten as the only god, that was not just a theological shift. Spet was a challenge to centuries of tradition, belief, and power. In this single act of carving, the scribe was rewriting Egypt's invisible architecture. He began, not with Amen, not with Ptah, not with Thoth, just with the Aten, and then Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. The stone was dry, soft in places, fragile in others. He worked slowly, reverently, and in the rhythm of his carving, he felt the rupture. This was not continuity. This was interruption. And yet he obeyed, because Akhenaten was not merely making a new city, he was erasing an old one. The year was roughly 1353 BCE. Egypt was strong but unstable. Amenhotep III had ruled with confidence and luxury, surrounded by priests and wives and foreign ambassadors bearing gifts from the far reaches of empire. His son, born Amenhotep IV, had inherited the throne with wealth and authority. But the boy was different. slender, elongated, often sickly in appearance. Artists began portraying him in strange ways: bulging belly, narrow limbs, heavy lips, elongated skull. Some say this was illness. Others say it was style, a visual theology, a deliberate distortion to show he was not quite human. Something between man and God. He changed his name. He abandoned Thebes. He closed the temples. He instructed artists to portray his family in intimate, naturalistic poses. And he elevated one god, the Atanta supremacy, not as a personified deity, but as an abstract sun disk, giver of light and life. And in doing so, it's created a crisis in Egypt's entire system of meaning, because Egypt was not merely polytheistic, it was hierarchically polytheistic. The gods were arranged, layered, integrated into every aspect of daily life. You prayed to Toret during childbirth. You sought Anubis in death. You invoked Mat in judgment. The state relied on these gods. The economy served their temples. Priests interpreted their will. And the king was the bridge between the divine and the earthly dot. So when Akhenaten declared that the Aten alone was worthy of worship, he wasn't just introducing a new god, he was removing the foundation beneath the entire society. The scribe felt this. He saw it in the anxious faces of older priests, demoted or reassigned. He heard it in the silence of shuttered temples. He noticed the absence of festivals, of incense trails, of hymns sung in shadowed halls. The economy of belief had shifted, and it rested now on a single point, a disk of light in the sky, and the name of the king who served it. He remembered when Amenhotep IV had first begun using that other name, Akhenaten. It had appeared gradually, first inside inscriptions, Tad, then in royal edicts, then exclusively, and it meant something precise, effective for the Aten. Not just a name, but a declaration of purpose. The king was now not a son of Ammon. He was a servant of Aten, but even more than that, Akhenaten wanted to ensure no one could forget. He ordered hundreds of cartouches to be carved into boundary stele. They dotted the cliffs around Akhenaten like invisible bookmarks in the landscape. Each declared the city's purpose. Each reinforced the centrality of Aten. Each rejected the centuries that had come before. The scribe, now back at his work table, reviewed the inscription he had carved. It was clean, precise. The disk of the Aten curved gently over the flat surface. The rays stretched downward, touching Akhenaten's name with tiny, sculpted hands. There were no other gods, no references to the old pantheon, no cryptic allusions. It was the plainest of radical declarations. And yet, he felt a weight in his chest, because names, he knew, had consequences. To inscribe a name was to preserve it, and to erase a name was to unmake it. That was the power of damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory. A tool used rarely, but with devastating effect. The Egyptians believed that to chisel out a name, to scrape away the lines that made identity, was to cast the soul into oblivion. No one would speak it. No one would remember. It was worse than death. It was disappearance. And something about Akhenaten's project made the scribe wonder. What if the pendulum swings back? What if, someday, another scribe is told to chisel his name away? He looked up at the dry cliff face. The sun hovered low in the sky, warm and endless, just as the Aten was said to be. The river below shimmered with dying light. The wind blew sand across the floor of this unfinished capital, and in that silence, he realized what he had done. He had preserved a moment, but also a risk, because what Akhenaten had done, what the scribe had helped him do, was interrupt the most sacred continuity in Egyptian culture, the unbroken line of names, gods, and rituals, in favor of one man's vision. One God, one son, one name, and if history has taught anything, it's that what can be carved can also be erased. So, as the chisel fell silent and the dust settled into the grooves of the stone, the scribe sat back and wondered, would anyone still speak this name in 100 years? Or would someone like him be sent to strike it out? By the 12th year of Akhenaten's reign, the city of Akhenaten is great. Sunlit experiment was no longer new. It still gleamed in places where paint clung stubbily to limestone. The broad avenues still stretched in rigid lines. The royal palace still cast long, thin shadows in the late-day sun. But beneath the surface, the stone was already softening. Its corners wore down faster than expected. Plaster flaked. The horizon wavered where walls should have stood firm. And the names, always the names, began to fade. They didn't fade from age. Not yet. They faded from intention. The scribes noticed it first. Quietly, hesitantly, on tablets, they began omitting certain phrases. On stele, they carved the name of the Aten, but not with the full detail. A sun disk, yes, but fewer rays. Hands left uncarved. Sometimes, on the inner walls of administrative buildings, they wrote the king's name without a cartouche, a small omission. Easy to miss. But in Egypt, where names were spells and identity was sacred, it was more than a clerical choice. It was a soft rebellion. These small absences spoke a quiet language. The priests, those few who remained, spoke it behind closed doors. The artisans whispered it while reshaping old reliefs. The citizens muttered it while passing temple ruins, now overrun with weeds. The sun shone just as brightly, and yet the Aten felt more distant. What had once been carved with zeal was now left undone. Some historians today point to year 12 as a turning point in Akhenaten's rule, not because of a single event, but because of a pattern. Foreign relations had suffered. Egypt's vassal states sent pleas for military support letters, discovered later in the Amarna archives, begging for gold, arms, soldiers. Most received no reply. The empire strained, while the king remained focused inward, absorbed in the theology of light. The court had shrunk. Powerful figures from Amenhotep III's era were dead, exiled, or simply missing. Nefertiti, once prominent, had vanished from many depictions. Her name, like the names of so many others, began to disappear from the walls, replaced by daughters, by shadows. Sometimes simply left blank. Even Akhenaten's name, which had once been inscribed with feverish repetition, began to slow in its spread. The scribes could feel it. One, a man named Mera, whose tomb was never finished, had served as overseer of the house of the Aten. He had carved the king's words, managed temple accounts, distributed grain, and logged daily offerings to the 18. His walls bore hymns praising the sun disk, yet in his final days, the work on his tomb ceased. The plaster was unpainted. The hieroglyphs abruptly stopped midline, and where one might expect to find Mary's cartouche, bold and permanent, it remained uncarved. Was it neglect or caution? Because to commit to Akhenaten now was not the same as it had been in year 4 or year 5. Then it was bold. Now it was dangerous. In Egypt, forgetting began with omission, and omission, when practiced deliberately, became erasure. The process wasn't sudden. No one stood in a central square and declared Akhenaten's memory void. There were no public proclamations, no dramatic excommunications. Instead, there was sand drifting quietly across open courtyards, filling unused thresholds, softening inscriptions on unfinished chapels. And there were chisels, not carving, but scraping, softly at first. A name rubbed off a statue base, face chipped away from a relief. The Aten's rays, once ending in benevolent hands, now snapped off midline. Scribes, who once chiseled to preserve, now scraped to forget, and they knew exactly where to begin. The cartouches were first Akhenatens, throne named Neferk, per when rad, being carefully encircled in royal ovals across hundreds of temple stones. Each one now became a target. Scribe assigned to this task was often not the same man who had carved the original. Perhaps that made it easier, less personal, less conflicted, but it was still dangerous work, because scraping away a name wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical. In Egyptian belief, it affected the Katha soul's vital essence. To destroy the name was to sever the soul's ties to the world. A soul without a name wandered, alone. UNREMEMBERED. And so, the work was done in silence, in rooms lit only by oil lamps, by men who said nothing. Sometimes they left traces. I have erased glyph, a line left incomplete. On one limestone block, recovered. Near Amarna, the name of Akhenaten has been crudely hacked out, but his image remains, as though the chisel faltered or stopped short. Another block shows the Aten sun disk intact, but its rays abruptly cut. The hands, once reaching down to touch the royal family, are now shattered. The ideology of light had become a shadow, back in the city. The people adapted. The bakers still kneaded dough. The masons still repaired walls. Children still played near the boundary steely. Life, even in a collapsing system, persisted, but the rituals changed. The morning hymns to the Aten were now half-spoken. Some turned back to the old gods quietly. In secret, a clay amulet of base appeared in a household shrine. A small figure of Torit surfaced beneath the floor. They were hidden acts, but they spoke loudly. The scribes were among the last to revert. Their training had been strict, their loyalty deeper, but they also had the most to lose. Every written word tied them to the theology of Akhenaten. Their tombs, if completed, praised him. Their statues, if permitted, showed them worshiping the Aten. Their inked records, if read, declared allegiance to a god that no longer looked powerful. And so they rewrote. First the ledgers, then the titles. A new official used the old phrase, beloved of Amen. Priest training wrote mud on a scrap of astrakhan. A letter from Memphis arrived with a small sealed the cartouche of Tutankhaten, son of Akhenaten. But a month later, the name changed. Tutankahamun. The god Amen had returned, and with him the slow dismantling of everything the sun disk had touched. The scribes knew what this meant. It meant new orders, a new theological style book, new name formulae. But most of all, it meant erasure, the formal, state-sanctioned, institutional removal of a king's name from history. Some historians argue that the systematic destruction of Akhenaten's legacy began under his own son. Others point to advisors A. Horemheb, who saw the return to orthodoxy as a way to stabilize Egypt's collapsing center. But for the scribes, the why mattered less than the how. They were now instructed to do what they had always been taught. Never to do, strike through the name. On one temple pylon, the cartouche of Akhenaten was not only removed, but replaced with a new one Thutmose III, a safe, strong name from a golden past. On boundary stele, the inscriptions were pockmarked, gouged, made unreadable. Akhenaten's statues were toppled, shattered, buried under new roads, or reused in walls. And the scribes, obedient as always, recorded the new names. The old ones they erased. Some may have felt guilt, others relief, but one wonders, did they remember? In the quiet of their chambers, late at night, reading a fading fragment of papyrus, did any of them pause and whisper the forbidden name? Out of loyalty, but because, deep down, they understood what it meant to be forgotten. They had once believed that to write a name was to give it permanence, that to carve a word was to grant immortality. But now they knew the opposite could be true. that even a king's name, repeated 1,000 times, could be made to vanish if the next hand was told to remove it. And so they wrote the new names, Amenhotep, Ramses, Seti, and they whispered the old one only in silence, because it still echoed in empty tombs with half-scraped cartuch and unfinished hymns on broken TELAE.T statues buried upside down in one sunlit city, slowly swallowed by sand, by sand. By the time the final sun set on Akhenaten, there were no witnesses left who had helped build it. No bricklayers measuring shadows to align temples with the solstice. No craftsmen sweating through alabaster reliefs of the royal family, cute children, chasing ibises along the long, straight streets. No priests bowing toward the morning light. The city had not been destroyed. That would have been too decisive, too loud. It had been uninhabited, slowly, intentionally, and then entirely. In the dry hush of abandonment, the process of forgetting began. Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, had become a place without prayers. The limestone blocks that once bore the king's vision of truth were now crumbling under their own idealism. The temples that had stood roofless to the sun were exposed, vulnerable. Their inscriptions wore away faster than older ones. The stone had been soft, hastily carved, unsealed, as if even the physical foundation had known it was temporary. But something always remains. Not everything can be erased, even in a world as practiced in memory as ancient Egypt. Sometimes forgetting leaves fingerprints. In the cliffs that overlook the city, the boundary still stood enormous slabs carved into the living rock. Each one a declaration, each one etched with a promise from Akhenaten himself that this place would be eternal. He had climbed those cliffs, or at least looked toward them, and named the boundaries of his sacred capital. He had invoked Aten, the radiant god of light, to bless the soil, the buildings, the air, and in dozens of lines of hieroglyphs, he had commanded, this city must never be changed, never be desecrated, never be forgotten. And then it was. But the stelae could not be moved. They were part of the cliff. Chiseling them away would have required more effort than any king wanted to spend on a failed experiment. So they were ignored, left out of records, omitted from lists of royal monuments, covered by desert winds. Some were partially defaced, names gouged, figures scratched, but none were completely destroyed. It was as if the past had not been removed, just pushed aside. And yet, even centuries later, when Egypt's power shifted to other cities, and other gods, and other kings, something still clung to Akhenaten. Travelers knew to avoid the place. It had no official name anymore. Locals called it the ruined city, or simply the place of the heretic. Some maps marked the area with a blank. Some scribes copied older texts and skipped over the names they didn't want to remember. But memory, like water, finds a way. The Amarna letters, hundreds of clay tablets written in Akkadian, had been buried in a side chamber of the old palace. Forgotten, overlooked, preserved. They weren't prayers or hymns. They were bureaucracy. Letters from Canaanite kings, emissaries, and administrators begging for help, confirming shipments, reminding Pharaoh of his agreements. Nothing dramatic. It's just survival in administrative form. And that's what made them survive. Because while monuments can be erased, storage rooms are often missed. And in those tablets, Akhenaten's world remained silent, orderly, unsentimental. It was the scribes again who preserved him, not out of loyalty, but because they recorded everything, even the end. One scribe, working decades later under the reign of Seti, I copied a list of previous kings. Akhenaten's name was missing. The list jumped directly from Amenhotep III to Tutankhamun, and then to I in Horemheb. In the margin, faintly, a separate hand had written a name. Not in hieroglyphs, but in shorthand, hieratic, a quiet correction, as if someone, somewhere, couldn't quite forget. Even centuries later, in the temples of Karnak and Luxor, reused blocks called talat appeared in new constructions. They had once belonged to Akhenaten's temples. They were structural filler. Their inscriptions were hidden inside walls, covered by newer, approved texts. But when modern archaeologists uncovered them, erased God returned piece by piece, like a whisper rising from dust. And so Akhenaten survived not through worship, or reverence, or devotion, but through the inability of a civilization to perfectly forget his image. Once violently chiseled off statues, left negative space hollow outlines that revealed what had been there. His name, scraped from cartouches, left faint depressions in stone. His city, buried under rubble and sand, preserved pottery shards, door lintels, and amulets of a god no one dared speak aloud. And perhaps most enduring of all was the memory of the scribes, the ones who had broken the rules by writing his name in the first place, and the ones who had broken them again by erasing it. Because in Egypt, writing was never neutral. To carve a name was to anchor it in time. To erase it was to cast it adrift. The scribes understood that better than anyone. They had spent their lives training under rigid systems, learning the correct forms, the sacred words, the expected order of history. They were not artists or poets. They were conservators of truth, as the state defined it. But when that definition changed, so did their tools. And yet, deep down, they must have known the erasures would not hold forever. You can chisel a name from a wall, but you cannot chisel it from the wind, or the habits of those who once spoke it aloud, or the deep, dry soil of a forgotten city built for a god of light. Akhenaten had declared his city eternal. He had commanded his name to be remembered. For a time, it seemed his enemies had won, but the scribes, those quiet, ink-stained bureaucrats who had recorded both rise and fall, left too many clues. Not because they intended to preserve him, but because they preserved everything. And when modern hands began to unearth those buried rooms, to translate those administrative tablets, to trace the scars of erased reliefs, they found him again. Not the divine visionary or the mad king, just a man who changed the rules. Can then vanished when the rules were rewritten again, and behind him a trail of names first added, then erased, then rediscovered. The scribe who broke the rules had, in the end, kept the memory alive, not through belief, book, through documentation, because history, even the most forgotten parts, leaves paperwork, and in Egypt, even the silence was carved in stone. Before there were bricks, before there were altars, and before a single temple faced the sun. There were lines in the dust, long, shallow furrows, drawn with a staff, measured with nothing but footsteps, sunlight, and intent. These were not markings left by engineers or city planners, but by priests and servants, tasked not with understanding, but with obedience. Somewhere out there in the Egyptian desert, between the curves of a gentle bay of cliffs and the loop of the Nile, a new capital was being imagined, not dreamt. Declared it was not a plan formed in meetings or debated in councils. There were no consultations with architects and thieves, no formal surveys of the terrain. The order came from the mouth of a King Akhenaten. It was obeyed. He wanted a new city, one unlike any before it. And he wanted it now. It would be called Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten, place untouched by the old gods, free from the weight of temples dedicated to Amen, Ptah, or Osiris. There would be no shrines to Anubis or Hathor here. This city would not grow organically over centuries like Memphis or Thebes. It would be born fully formed, preordained, as if it had always been waiting beneath the sand, just out of reach. But in truth, it was built in haste, and from the beginning, The city betrayed that haste. The soil was poor for farming. The limestone was soft and flaky, unfit for long-lasting construction. The cliffs that ringed the bay were low and crumbling. The river was far enough away to require wells, canals, and constant hauling of water. It was, in short, an impractical place, but that was part of the point. Akhenaten wasn't choosing a location based on resources or military strategy. He was choosing absence. The emptiness was the feature. A blank page for a theology that could not survive in the margins of older cities. And so, just as he had declared a new god, the Aten, a formless sun disk whose rays touched only the royal family, he now declared a new home. You can still see the boundary steely if you visit the Dud cliffs today. Massive vertical inscriptions carved directly into the stone. They don't mark the borders of farmland or the limits of taxation. They mark sacred ground. The ground Aten had shown the king in a vision. It's ground that was to remain untouched, unchanged, and eternally pure. Those inscriptions were some of the first things made. Not walls, not roads, not granaries, or guard posts. The borders were carved first, as if the divine needed its lines drawn before the people could move in. Then came the buildings. And they came fast, too fast. The stone blocks used to construct the temples and palaces were much smaller than usual. Just a few feet wide and easy to carry. They're called talatat today, a term given much later. They were designed for speed, not strength. Lightweight, modular, mass-producible. Masons could place hundreds in a day, where larger blocks would have taken teams in weeks. The carvings, too, were made quickly. You can still run your fingers across some of them, polished, shallow, soft. The scenes of Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti offering gifts to the Aten were drawn in repetition, almost like stamps. No deep hieroglyphic layers. No grand multi-god scenes. It's just variations of the same image, sun disk above, royal couple beneath, and those strange, exaggerated faces that so defined Amarna art. It was as if time itself had been compressed, but in that rush, something vital was missed. Permanence. Temples made of talatat blocks did not last long. Without proper foundations and protective casing stones, the structures crumbled. Roofs collapsed. Doorways sagged. The fine gypsum plaster used on the inner walls to depict vibrant images peeled away after a few seasons of humidity. Even in the king's own palace, there was evidence of corner cutting. The great palace of Akhenaten was enormous by design, broad halls, wide colonnades, sun-filled courts, but the bricks were mud, not stone. The ceilings were timber, prone to rot. Even the decorative floors, beautiful in their way, showing scenes of birds and papyrus, were made in haste, with painted tiles instead of inlaid stone. None of it was meant to endure centuries, and yet it was not a failure of engineering, but a reflection of Akhenaten's ideology. This was a king focused on the divine in the moment, on the fleeting rays of light, on daily rituals rather than eternal monuments. In his eyes, eternity wasn't measured in stone, it was measured in devotion, carried out every day as the Aten rose and fell. Time did not move forward in a marne, it reset every dawn, and this philosophy bled into the city's very structure. Homes were laid out in rows, but not rigid grids. The central avenue was grand, meant for royal processions, but the side streets wound and shifted. Bureaucrats lived near scribes. Temple priests lived beside bakers. There were workshops, storehouses, kitchens, and garden plots, teas, but all of it was temporary. Wooden beams, clay ovens, painted plaster walls. Even the city's name, Akhenaten, was a poetic illusion. The horizon of the Aten. Not a place on a map, but a concept. That transience can still be felt in the ruins. Walk through the modern site of Amarna, and you'll see the foundations of houses, not walls. Dust outlines where shelves once stood, pits where bread was baked, rooms with no names. There are no towering monuments, no preserved pillars, faint imprints of a life built quickly and left behind even quicker. And yet, people lived here, thousands of them. They rose with the sun and sang the morning hymns. They wrote letters on clay tablets and wrapped fish in palm leaves. They fetched water from wells and placed offerings on simple household altars. They complained about taxes and asked the gods for children. They mourned their dead and painted blue lotuses on their DOOSTs. They built a city not just for Aten, but for themselves. And the evidence of that daily life is everywhere if you know where to look. Tiny copper tools, amulets made from faience, figurines of animals, bits of linen, burned grain, cosmetic jars, ink pots, all of it small, all of it fragile, but all of it real. The speed with which Amarna rose was not just political, it was logistical. Artisans were called in from across the country. Laborers were drafted into service. Scribes were reassigned. Resources were reallocated from Thebes. Even foreign artisans may have been brought in to help design courtyards, ponds, and the king's open air temples. Within 3 years, the city functioned. Within 5, it was thriving, and within 2 decades, it was abandoned. No conquest, no fire, no plague, just the quiet, deliberate return of power to the old gods, and the slow, methodical dismantling of a city that had never been meant to outlive its king. Why build in such haste, only to let it fall? Why pour effort into palaces, streets, and boundaries steely, only to walk away? What did the workers think as they packed up their tools, knowing the walls they built were already crumbling? And what did the scribes write, if anything, about the moment the sun set on the city for the last time? We don't know, because much of Amarna's story is told through its absence, and sometimes the silence is louder than a stone. In most Egyptian cities, the layers of time run deep. Beneath temples, older temples, beneath palaces, earlier homes. Stones are taken from the ruins of previous dynasties, and new prayers are carved over old ones. Even the Nile, in its annual flood, deposits a memory each year, silt over tombs, oil over thresholds. But Amarna was different. There was nothing under it. No ancient shrines, no family tombs, no centuries of layered meaning. The city emerged suddenly on ground that had not previously mattered. And once it was abandoned, almost nothing was built over it for thousands of years. The desert simply crept back in. This absence is its most defining trait. To understand that strangeness, you have to understand what the city lacked. It lacked ancestral memory. In Thebes, Memphis, and Heliopolis, you would find statues of kings who reigned centuries earlier, side by side with current rulers. Names from the past lived on through inscriptions, genealogy, temple rituals, and sacred architecture. Worship was as much about remembering as it was about praising. But Akhenaten rejected memory when he founded Akhenaten, chose to start time. Over the past, at least, the religious past was considered impure. The old gods were not forgotten in the usual way. They were deliberately excluded. Amen. The king of gods in Thebes was never named in Amarna inscriptions. His images were scratched off walls. His priests were left behind. Even the word gods was often replaced with the singular references to the Aten. This wasn't just theological reform, it was cultural erasure. Imagine a modern city without museums, monuments, or cemeteries. No holidays based on history, or tributes to founders. No ancestral shrines. Amarna was exactly that. The only history that mattered was the present moment of Aten's light, embodied in the king and queen. That choice created a city that had no roots, and in the ancient world, rootless cities did not last long. Even the way the city functioned reflected its lack of permanence. Take, For instance, the administration. Akhenaten moved the bureaucracy of Egypt to Akhenaten, but only just enough to make it work. He brought scribes, stewards, and royal officials, but the full machinery of government, the deeper networks of local control and temple. Finance remained in older cities like Memphis and Thebes. Letters found in the city's archives, known as the Amarna letters, reveal a constant state of improvisation. These clay tablets, written in Akkadian cuneiform, were correspondence between the Egyptian court and foreign rulers in Canaan, Syria, and beyond. But reading them today, sense the administrative thinness of the city. Local officials plead for support. Vassal kings write confused replies. Even Egyptian governors stationed abroad sometimes express bewilderment at the new religious policies. It's as if the city had become the center of the empire's sunlight, but not of its spine. And perhaps that was intentional by weakening traditional centers of powers. Essentially, the vast temples of Akhenaten centralized authority in himself. But the price of that centralization was instability. Even daily life in Amarna bore marks of tension. Homes were smaller than in other cities, not because people were poor, many were quite well off, but because the city was so quickly assembled, and its ideals so focused on spiritual alignment with the Atan. The architecture followed a strange logic. The temples were built without roofs to allow direct sunlight, defying centuries of enclosed, sacred design. Homes had central altars with small shrines to Aten, rather than to a family's ancestral gods. Public buildings were aligned with the path of the sun, not with cardinal directions. The effect was disorienting. Visitors from other parts of Egypt would have found Amarna deeply unfamiliar, even unsettling. The gods they had prayed to for generations were absent. The style of art, with its elongated faces, sloping eyes, and exaggerated bodies, broke sharply with the stately formality of traditional Egyptian sculpture. Even the royal family was depicted differently. Akhenaten is shown with a curved belly, narrow limbs, and wide hips. Nefertiti, too, is drawn in an exaggerated style, neither fully masculine nor feminine, but androgynous, radiant, divine. Their daughters are shown playing, crying, or clinging to their parents in public scenes, something almost unheard of in traditional pharaonic art. It was as if the royal household was not just a symbol of power, but a microcosm of the cosmos. And yet, it didn't work. Or rather, it couldn't last. Amarna's religious exclusivity became its vulnerability. A city so deeply tied to one God, one theology. One royal line could not survive the collapse of that singular vision, and that collapse began with death. Akhenaten died sometime around 1336 BCE. What happened next remains unclear. The line of succession is murky. There may have been a co-regent, a Kor. There may have been a brief reign by a mysterious figure named Smenkhare, and then Tutankhaten. The boy king changed his name to Tutankhamun, and with that small shift, the course of Egyptian history changed again. The gods returned, so did the temples. The capital moved back to Memphis and Thebes, and Amarna began to unravel. It was not destroyed in anger. There was no massive rebellion, no burning of buildings. It simply emptied. Officials packed up. Families moved. The stone blocks, those modular talents, were dismantled and shipped away. Temples were decommissioned. Tombs remained unfinished. Cadres left their tools. Scribes left their palettes. Even the palace was stripped. Within a generation, the city was gone. There left behind no successor. No memory in the public rituals, no mention in festivals. The name Akhenaten was omitted from king lists. Its founders' name Akhenaten was actively erased from monuments. Chisels scratched it off temple walls. Papyrus documents refused to mention it. Even his tomb was vandalized. All because the city had never been about the people. It had been about the idea. And when that idea ended, so did the city. What's fascinating is that Amarna's disappearance was so thorough, we only rediscovered it in the 18th century, when European travelers first came across the strange ruins near the village of El Amarna. They didn't know what they were seeing. It was too clean, too flat, too symmetrical, and too empty. Archaeologists who studied it in the 19th and 20th centuries were stunned by how complete the abandonment had been. Pottery was still lying in kilns. Unfinished carvings remained on stones. Scribes' notes were left behind. It was as if the city had simply stood up and walked away. No other capital city in Egyptian history was treated this way. Even cities that lost prominence like Toi or Tanis retained religious meaning, regional importance, or at least architectural presence. But Akhenaten had no past and no future. It existed intensely for 2 decades, and then it didn't. Why was such a dramatic rupture necessary? Why not let the city evolve? Why not repurpose its temples for other gods? Why erase, rather than adapt? Perhaps because to remember Amarna was to remember a mistake. A mistake that had nearly broken Egypt's political and religious unity. Mistake that had weakened its military strength and strained its relations with vassal states. A mistake embodied not just in a name, but in stone, art, ritual, and theology. The erasure was not about one man. It was about removing a question. Could Egypt function with only one god? Could a city built on sunlight replace centuries of divine tradition? Could memory itself be outlawed? In the end, the silence of Amarna became louder than its construction ever was. It stood for everything Egypt was told not to be, and that made it dangerous long after it disappeared. The last person to leave Amarna did not slam a door. They did not shout or record the moment or carry a banner from the city gates. They simply walked away. Maybe they looked back. Maybe they didn't. But by the time they reached the hills, or the river, or the edge of the nearby village that had never quite embraced the new capital, Amarna had already begun to vanish. It didn't take long. The desert is slow, but it is also patient. Without priests to sweep the thresholds, without workers to repair the mud brick, without scribes to copy the words of the king into fresh reliefs, the wind and the sun took over. Roofs caved in, doors fell, paint faded, columns cracked, and the sands crept in not violently, but methodically, day after day, by the reign of Akhenaten's likely son, and political reversal. The city had already been declared a detour from the true path. It was not just politically abandoned, it was theologically condemned. The few surviving references to Akhenaten in official records referred to it obliquely as that place or the heretic city, and what was once the focus of an entire civilization's sunlight disappeared. But the story of Amarna didn't end with its physical abandonment. It continued underground both literally and metaphorically. The archaeology of absence. When modern excavators arrived at Amarna in the 1800s, they were baffled by how complete the emptiness was. They were used to layered ruins, temples built over temples with collapsed walls that could be sifted and traced, cities reconfigured a dozen times over centuries. But Amarna was flat, almost unnaturally so. The streets were still visible. Carved into the soft rock stone thresholds remained in place. In some homes, the imprint of floor mats and low mud brick benches could still be seen. There were even pottery shards with shopping lists, orders, and mundane notes left behind, so ordinary that they seemed surreal. One broken sherd read, simply, 2 loaves, 1 fish. That, perhaps, is what made Amarna so striking to modern historians. Not just its suddenness, but its ordinariness. The people who had lived there, thousands of them, had gone about their lives as if the city would last forever. They planted trees, dug latrines, swept courtyards, taught their children. And yet, behind those ordinary acts was a knowledge deep or faint that everything rested on the favor of a single king and his God. When that favor ended, so did the city. The few who stayed maybe out of poverty or because they had nowhere else to go left little trace. No new temples were built. No graves were dug into the central hills. Even the most devoted followers of Aten had no interest in preserving the place once the royal court moved on. And so, Amarna became something else. Not just a forgotten capital, but a rare archaeological time capsule. A city frozen at the moment of its own failure. Stones that were meant to travel. One of the most unusual facts about Amarna's architecture is how deliberately movable it was. Many of the city's buildings, especially the temples and palaces, were constructed using talatat, small, standardized stone blocks that could be assembled and disassembled quickly. Unlike the giant megaliths of Karnak or Luxor, these blocks were modular, uniform, and easy to transport. It was almost as if Akhenaten had anticipated the need to move, or to be moved. When the city was abandoned, these talata were indeed moved. Thousands were shipped to Thebes, Memphis, and other cities to be reused as filler in new temples, many of which were now being built to honor Aten, the very gods that Akhenaten had tried to erase. In a strange irony, the stones once used to praise Aten were hidden inside structures that glorified Amen. And yet, because they were buried inside walls and pylons, many of these blocks survived far better than if they had remained exposed to the desert winds. Modern archaeologists, starting in the 20th century, began painstakingly identifying and cataloging them. Some were found in the Karnak temple complex turned sideways, carved over, or placed in unseen foundations. Piece by piece, researchers began reconstructing murals, processions, and inscriptions that had once decorated the halls of Akhenaten's temples. It was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle where most of the pieces were inside someone else's house. These blocks, displaced and hidden, became the single most expansive archive of Amarna-style art and royal theology. The city had vanished, but its fragments had infiltrated the rest of Egypt. The people who were forgotten, but what of the people? We know about Akhenaten and Nefertiti. We know their statues, their images, the names of some of their daughters. But what about the others? Archaeologists have uncovered a workers' cemetery at Amarna's simple burials, without ornament or inscription. Most bodies were hastily interred, some in mass graves. The bones show signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, decay, and heavy labor at young ages. These weren't the elite artisans of Dr el-Medina who built royal tombs. These were the ordinary laborers, the ones who quarried stone, carried bricks, and died young. One study showed that some children began carrying heavy loads before the age of 10. Adult skeletons showed signs of chronic stress, compressed spines, and overuse injuries. The city may have been a theological utopia in Akhenaten's eyes, but for many of its inhabitants it was a place of toil. They did not leave behind prayers to Aten. Their names were not recorded. Their homes were swept away before they could become ruins. And yet, their bodies silent and contorted are some of the clearest records of Amarna's realities. Their forgotten lives tell us the city was not just an idea. It was a machine that consumed effort. A lesson in fragility. Amarna's suddenness sets meteoric rise and silent fall offers a unique insight into how civilizations work. It shows us how fragile even the most confident reforms can be. Akhenaten had power. He had control of Egypt's military, priesthood, treasury, and artistic direction. He could rewrite theology. He could build a capital from scratch. But he could not build consensus, even with the force of the state behind him. His belief he imposed sunlight. Above all, a single god for all never truly took root in the hearts of most Egyptians when the dynasty ended. So did the illusion. Egypt returned to the gods of grain, flood, fertility, and rebirth, to the chants of temple priests, to the rhythms of familiar myths, to the comforting architecture of eternity. The Aten was not rejected because it was false. It was rejected because it was insufficient. It did not allow room for the thousand small needs that had always filled the Egyptian spirit. And so Amarna became not just a failed city, but a lesson, a warning about revolutions that go too far, about visions that leave no room for compromise, about the cost of abandoning the past too quickly. And even now, as you walk through the low, windswept ruins near the village of El Amarna, you can still see the grid of streets etched into the stone. You can see outlines of homes with shallow basins that once held offerings to a god who had no face. Light on, if you listen closely, not with your ears, but with your imagination. You might still hear the faint scratch of a scribe's stylus, the quiet hum of a potter's wheel, the soft patter of a child's feet in sand, the echoes of a city that was never supposed to last, but which still hasn't quite vanished. In ancient Egypt, the gods had faces, hawk-headed, jackal-headed, lioness-faced, or Kayuradich deity stood for something familiar, something you could picture. Horus, with his sharp-beaked vision of kingship. Thoth, the baboon-faced scribe of the heavens. Hathor, the maternal cow whose warmth poured down in blessings. Even a man, the most elusive of gods, was eventually given form blue-skinned, crowned, wrapped in mystery, but still visible. And then, almost without warning, there was Aten, not as a man, not as a hawk, not as a beast, not as a blend of forms. Etn was a disk, a plain, round disk. The sun itself, beaming rays that ended not in fire or light, but in fingers, hands that reached out to touch the faces of the living king and queen. And in this silent geometry, a perfect circle in a sky of stories, Egypt's entire religious architecture cracked open. It didn't begin with thunder. It didn't begin with war. It began, quietly, with a name. Before the disk rose to understand how radical Aten's appearance was. You have to remember how crowded the Egyptian heavens were before Akhenaten came to power. There were gods for every city, every profession, every emotion, every season, for childbirth, for embalming, for cows, bees, beer, and silence. Some gods, like Ra and Amen, had vast priesthoods and monumental temples. Others lived only in family altars and small offerings. The system wasn't chaotic, it was layered, like irrigation canals branching from the Nile. Egypt's gods soaked into every aspect of life. No one questioned this. The order of the gods reflected the order of the world. Pharaohs supported dozens of cults at once. Amen at Karnak, Ra at Heliopolis, Osiris and Abydos. The gods had shrines in every royal building, every tomb, every festival. Pharaohs prayed, blessed, sacrificed, and celebrated in honor of them all. Harmony required it, and then Amenhotep IV took the throne. He was young, possibly corrigent with his father, Amenhotep III. At first, he followed the script, honoring Amen, building at Karnak, performing rituals. But behind the scenes, something was shifting. Quietly, incrementally, more prayers began to focus not on Amen or Ra or Ptah, but on a new formulation. Rewrote, who rejoices in the horizon in his name as the light which is in the Aten. A strange, clumsy phrase, almost legal in its precision. Formula, not a hymn, not a god, Ket, but something was gathering. The Aten emerges over time. The name got shorter, simpler, just Aten. The Aten was the sun disk, not the god inside it, not Ra, not Harkti, not any of the familiar figures, just the light itself, the radiant circle, the source of life, visible to all, needing no temple to dwell in. It was, in theory, the most obvious god in the sky. But there was a problem. The Aten had no myths, no childhood, no enemies, no death, no rebirth, no boat through the underworld, no sister, no rival, no cycle of vengeance or forgiveness. The Aten just was a blinding, constant, heavenly geometry, a presence you couldn't look at directly, and it needed a mouthpiece. It needed someone to point and say, there, that is God. That person was Akhenaten. The king becomes the Lensan Egyptian religion. The king had always been a bridge. He mediated between the gods and the people. He offered, he prayed, he built temples, he joined the gods in death. But under Akhenaten, the king didn't just mediate. He became essential. No one worshipped the Aten directly. Not the priests, not the farmers, not the soldiers or scribes. Worship flowed from the Aten to Akhenaten, from Akhenaten to everyone else. This wasn't entirely new. Divine kingship had always been part of the Egyptian world, but now it was exclusive. Without Akhenaten there was no religion. Without Akhenaten, the light of the Aten was not accessible, and so everything in Amarne, the new city, was arranged to support this strange solar funnel. Temples had no roofs. Sunlight poured directly onto altars. Statues of Akhenaten and Nefertiti stood in place of gods. Hymns praised not Aten alone, but Aten through the king. Even the great hymn to the Atena, beautiful, poetic texts often compared to later monotheistic. Prayers doesn't invite individuals to speak directly to the divine. It speaks of the Aten's glory and the king's role in revealing it. The people in this theology were like plants. They lived only in sunlight. A world without shadows. You might imagine a religion based on sunlight would be optimistic, but in practice, the Aten cult was strangely cold. There was no underworld, no promise of renewal, no Osiris to judge the dead, no journey through the stars. When you died, you didn't hope to join a pantheon. You hoped to bask in the rays of Aten forever, at least stay near the king, who remained the sole beacon. It was a flattening of heaven. Temples to other gods were closed, defaced, or simply ignored. Names were scraped off monuments. Statues of Amen were torn down. Even the word gods, in plural form, was sometimes removed from texts. The multiplicity of Egypt's spiritual life was being rewritten into a singular being. Why? Historians still debate Akhenaten's motives. Was he a religious visionary, obsessed with purity? Was he a political strategist, breaking the power of the Amen priesthood? Was he an eccentric, surrounded by loyal scribes and courtiers who carried out his vision? Was he ill, decay, or was he just convinced that only one force in the universe was worth focusing on? The Aten, a disk without a face. The faces that remained ironically, though the Aten had no face. Akhenaten left us plenty of his own. His statues were strange, elongated, androgynous, alien, wide hips, narrow eyes, pointed chins. He was nothing like the square-jawed kings of earlier dynasties. Some suggest this was a stylized art form, emphasizing his break with tradition. Others speculate about medical conditions, but the real significance lies in what these statues excluded. There were no divine animals, no hybrid beings, no Osiris wrapped in linen, no Horus flying above the king's head. Instead, the Aten hovered above as a simple disk, with rays ending in tiny hands that touched the royal family's noses and mouths. Sometimes they held eggs, symbols of life. The king and queen Akhenaten and Nefertiti were shown cradling children, kissing them, playing gently beneath the rays. It was a visual theology of intimacy, domestic, bizarrely human. The divine wasn't distant, was in the family. In the family, Saturn was the only path to the divine, a closed circuit of light and blood, and everyone else, they stood outside as the sun set on this new world order. As the king aged and his grip loosened, You might wonder, what happens to a god who has no myths? What happens to a religion where no one else can pray? And what happens to a people when their only path to heaven is through a man who can die? Theaden watched in silence. The disk never blinked, but shadows were forming again at the edges of the court, old gods waiting behind. Broken walls. You might imagine a ruler so devoted to his god would be constantly surrounded by priests, but Akhenaten needed no clergy. He was the priest and the prophet, and the only voice it taught required. In the city of Amarnat's foundations, barely cured, its stones still sharp with the daily rhythms of worship, were orchestrated not in shadowed sanctuaries, but in broad sunlight. There were no darkened chambers, no sacred processions hidden behind veils of incense, no chanting from cloistered halls. Worship happened under the sky. Stone platforms, open-air altars stood, exposed to the raw Egyptian sun. Offerings of bread, beer, flowers, and meat were laid out where Aten's rays could reach them directly. The sun didn't need to be coaxed inside. It already touched everything. And Akhenaten, he was always central in the scene. Each relief, each stiller, each shrine repeated the same idea. The rays of Aten flowed down not to the people, not to the city, but to the king and queen, who in turn offered the light back to the land. If Aten was the sun, Akhenaten was its lens. Theology in limestone, most Egyptian gods had an origin story, a cosmic birth, a conflict, a triumph. They ruled parts of the world: sky, river, desert, death, fertility, judgment, and their temples functioned like houses, homes for the god's statue, which had to be fed, dressed, anointed, and honored daily. But the Aten had no statue. There was no divine image hidden in the inner sanctuary, no god to wake in the morning, no eyes to paint, no food to place before sacred feet. Instead, a blank altar under the sky. That was enough. This broke every rule of Egyptian temple ritual, and in breaking it, Akhenaten demanded something more radical: trust that Aten needed. No guardian. Trust that ritual could be stripped of symbols. Trust that divinity did not live in darkness, but in daylight alone. It was, in a way, a philosophy of clarity, but it left very little room for uncertainty or ambiguity or doubt. Everything, always, came back to the king. The hymns that rewrote the world, only a few complete hymns to Aten survive. The most famous, the Great Hymn, was found in the tomb of I, who later became Pharaoh after Tutankhamun. It reads like a blend of scientific observation, personal reverence, and political doctrine. It praises Aten for making the world, for ordering the seasons, for feeding animals, for shining on foreign lands and guiding all life through light. But always, at its center, is the king. You are in my heart, and there is no other who knows. You accept your son, Akhenaten. You have made him wise in your designs and your power. It's not a prayer of the people. It's a declaration from the throne, and what it omits is just as revealing as what it includes. There is no mention of Osiris, no underworld, no judgment, no resurrection. There are no traditional funerary blessings. The afterlife is not a return to the stars, but a continuation in light. How would that comfort the grieving? What does it offer? A dying farmer, a weeping widow, or a fallen soldier? No answer was given. Only light, domestic divinity. Curiously, one of the most striking shifts in the Amarna religion wasn't celestial, but intimate. Akhenaten didn't just rule beside Nefertiti. He showed her as co-worshipper, co-receiver of the rays. In sculpture, she's shown almost as often as he is, sometimes even more central. Their daughters appeared too small, delicate, always under the sun's fingers. There's a domestic quality to Amarna art. Gone are the stiff, formal family portraits of earlier dynasties. In their place, scenes of affection, kisses on cheeks, fingers touching foreheads. This was a new kind of divine. Image. 1, where the family became the holy vessel and the private became public theology. But was it relatable to the people? Did it resonate beyond palace walls? Or did it feel distant, abstract, just another ritual they weren't allowed to join? Don't know, because for all this art, there are almost no personal letters, no graffiti, no prayers from commoners to 18 that survive. Only the voice of the king. What the priests must have thought behind the temple closures. The chiseled out names, the abandoned shrines. We can imagine something that is only half visible in the records. Silence. The priesthood of Amun, once one of the most powerful political and economic forces in Egypt, had their power stripped, their temples emptied, their rituals cancelled, their incomes seized. Amun's name was erased from walls, not just from the present, but from history. That's the thing about Egypt. To erase a name was to erase a soul, and Akhenaten did it systematically. You may wonder, why didn't they rebel? Perhaps some did. Perhaps many quietly waited, certain that no king, however luminous, could silence the gods forever. They had seen dynasties rise and fall. They had buried kings with their own hands. They could wait, and in their waiting, they preserved the memory of a world with more than just one god, a religion of absence, despite the grandeur of his new city and theology. Akhenaten left out something crucial, a connection to the past. He ordered tombs built for his courtiers in Amarna, complete with long inscriptions praising him in the Aten, but those tombs are strangely unfinished. Their decorations end abruptly. Their funerary texts are sparse. Their prayers seem formulaic. It's as if no one knew quite what to say about death anymore. Or perhaps they weren't allowed to say it. Without Osiris, what was the journey of the dead? Without Mat, what was justice? Without Thoth, who recorded the truth. These gods had shaped the language of meaning for millennia, and now their names were banned. All that remained was the light that could burn. We tend to think of sunlight as gentle, warming, necessary, but in Egypt, the sun could also kill. It could parch fields, crack stone, blind eyes. It could harden the land into desert. And under Akhenaten, the Aten became everything, both the warmth and the drought, the comfort and the scorch. No shadows, no refuge, no stories, just the presence of something too bright to face directly, and the figure of a man long-headed, sunken-eyed, possibly tall, standing in the center of it all, saying, "Only I can see." But even kings cannot look at the sun forever, and even the sun, for all its power, eventually sets. What happens to a god whose name no one dares speak? What happens when the light moves on and the city built for it fades back into dust? By the time Akhenaten died, the city of Amarna was barely 2 decades old. Its columns still bore the scars of tools, its statues of the king and queen, with their elongated skulls and curling toes, stood solemn under the desert sky. Their strange beauty, so unlike the timeless forms of earlier dynasties, seemed frozen, unsure of whether it belonged to memory or myth. Aten still shone, but the people were already turning to their older prayers. Quietly, cautiously, they whispered the names that had been forbidden. Amen, Osiris, Hathor. Names that returned like water after drought. And then the king was gone. The afterlife he never described. Akhenaten's burial remains a mystery. There was a royal tomb prepared for him in the cliffs near Amarna, deep, winding shaft with unfinished walls, shallow carvings, hand damage that suggests it may have been desecrated soon after it was sealed. No golden coffin has ever been found. No lavish funerary texts, just fragments, a crushed sarcophagus lid, shattered canopic jars. A few inscriptions, still praising the Aten, and a question, was he buried here at all? Some scholars believe his body may have been moved to Thebes, or perhaps even to KV 55 in the Valley of the Kings, where a mummy of a tall, male royal was found in a damaged coffin with no name. DNA evidence links that mummy to Tutankhamun, his son, and Queen Tai, his mother, but no one can say for certain whether the bones in KV 55 are truly Akhenaten's, if he had hoped to become one with Aten. The records offer little evidence that the light welcomed him home. The boy, king, and the backward steps, after Akhenaten's death, his son Tutankhaten took the throne. He was a child. Barely 9. Behind him stood advisors, generals, courtiers who had survived the Amarna, Kiers, and now saw a chance to restore the old ways. And so the boy's name was changed. Tutankhaten became Tutankhamun, the living image of Amen. The temples of Karnak reopened. The priests returned. Statues of Akhenaten were pulled down, their faces smashed. The rays of Aten were chiseled off walls. Royal tombs in Thebes were begun again, this time with Osiris watching from painted walls. The sun had not been enough. People needed stories, and the old gods, buried but never gone, returned to give them back. What couldn't be erased yet, even in erasing Akhenaten. Something remained. In the art of later dynasties, you can still feel echoes of Amarna, the more natural poses, the subtle smiles, the glimpse of intimacy in royal portraits. Even the language of worship evolved. Aten's hymns, once revolutionary, may have influenced later psalms and sacred texts, and most of all, this idea lived on, that a single God could stand above all. Others. Egypt would not adopt monotheism again for centuries, not until Christianity and later Islam arrived, but the thought had been planted. One God, one truth, one light. Was Akhenaten the first monotheist in history? Some believe so. Others argue his faith was never truly universal, that it was exclusive, royal, inaccessible. Not monotheism for the people, just a palace theology. But still, he tried, and for a time, he made the whole kingdom orbit a single point in the sky, what his builders left behind when Amarna was abandoned. It wasn't destroyed. Its limestone buildings were left to the elements. Its temples crumbled. Its streets, once alive with royal guards, scribes, artisans, and grain merchants, slowly filled with sand. Later, kings stripped it for stone. Horemheb, Ramses' tooth, they all reused blocks from Amarna to build temples in Thebes. But the blocks still bore marks of the old god sun rays with little hands. Hymns to Aten, the unmistakable cartouches of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And so, foundations of later buildings, the heretic king endured, buried, out of sight, but still there. A name rewritten, story unfinished in Egypt. To erase a name was to kill a soul twice, and Akhenaten's name was erased from king lists. He was not included in the official records of dynasties, not remembered as a pharaoh, not honored with shrines or festivals. His legacy was silence, but the desert keeps secrets. In the 19th century, when archaeologists began to uncover Amarna, they were stunned. The art, the language, the theology, it didn't match anything they expected. This wasn't a lost city. It was a lost thought, a failed experiment, a vision of light that had tried to replace millennia of myth with the movement of the sun, and failed. But perhaps it didn't vanish entirely. Today, we know his name again. We say Akhenaten. We study his strange face. We ask why he erased the old gods, why he chose the sun, why he closed the temples, and maybe, in the asking, restore a small part of him, even if we never understand him fully, even if he remains the God's voice that faded before it could be heard. Final reflection, the sun that rises, also sets, and the God that shines without form may be remembered only in fragments, half-ruined walls, and erased names. But the attempt to believe that a world could change if it only followed one light that remains. Akhenaten's Egypt was a pause, quiet interruption, lines scratched across the script of history, and when the old gods returned, they came back different. Perhaps that was his legacy, not the god, but the silence that followed. The desert holds its breath where the cliffs of Amarna rise. There are no pyramids here, no lush processions of palm trees or temple gardens, only hard limestone hills etched by wind and silence. Somewhere in those ridges, hidden in a long, sloping wadi, lies a tomb that was supposed to be remembered forever. Instead, it was forgotten so thoroughly that even the god it was built for was erased. This was the royal tomb of Akhenaten, and for all its ambition, all its sunlight theology, it was missing something elemental. There were no mourners, no final prayers carved at the end, no weeping priests, no food offerings renewed generation after generation, and strangely, no body. A tomb built in a hurry. The tomb itself lies in a royal wadi, dry valley east of the city of Amarnakut, deep into rock by teams of laborers whose chisels still left raw scars on the walls. It was designed to mimic the classic shape of royal tombs in the Valley of the King's Long, corridor-like, inward descending, with side chambers carved at intervals and a main burial hall at the rear. But it was never finished. Its walls, for long stretches, remained blank. No protective spells from the Book of the Dead, no vivid illustrations of gods greeting the king, no judgment scene, no weighing of the heart. Instead, there are only sparse carvings reliefs showing Akhenaten with his family, hands lifted toward the sun, discotten. In many places, the figures are unfinished. In others, they were once chiseled out and later hacked away in damnatio memoria. Here and there, broken inscriptions remain, pieces of Aten's hymns, half-erased names. The sarcophagus was once beautifully decorated with cartouches of Akhenaten's daughter, Akhenaten. She had died young, possibly during childbirth. The chamber is one of the few side rooms that seems completed. Her scenes show mourning. Nefertiti bent over her daughter's lifeless form, servants bringing ointments and linens. But even these scenes were defaced. No one was meant to remember who once lay there. Where was the king? For decades, archaeologists debated whether Akhenaten had ever been buried here. The burial hall seems prepared. A stone platform rises from the floor, intended to hold a sarcophagus. Fragments of a pink granite coffin were found nearby, decorated not with the usual protective deities, but with sun rays of Aten ending in tiny human hands. Some of these fragments were recovered in the 1920s and 1930s by British teams. They included part of the lid, broken at the corners, and pieces of the base. These fragments showed clear damage, deliberate smashing. There was a sense that someone had entered the tomb, not to rob it, but to destroy what remained. No mummy was ever found, not even fragments of a body, wrappings, or jewelry. Nothing to suggest that the founder of Amarna had found rest in the city he built. Instead, only broken things. A coffin without bones, a burial chamber without gods, a tomb with no mourners. KV-55. The ghost identity. Then, in 1907, in the Valley of the King's far from Amarna, new discovery was made. Tomb, KV-55. It was an unmarked burial, a sealed chamber with one coffin, one body, and scattered ritual objects. The coffin's faceplate had been hacked off. The inscriptions had been altered. The gold and inlays had been removed or damaged, and the body inside, though royal, was found without wrappings, decayed, disrespected. Among the items in KV-55 were a shattered canopic chest with the name of Queen Tai, Akhenaten's mother. Also found were magical bricks naming Akhenaten, suggesting he may have been reburied here, smuggled quietly out of Amarna after the fall of his city. Yet scholars remain divided. The bones tall, male, and around 30 to 40 years old, could belong to Akhenaten, but the identity is not certain. Some argue it was Smenkir, the mysterious co-regent, or a half-brother. Others suggest it was a symbolic bariola political move by later pharaohs to clean up the past, whoever it was. The burial was a quiet one, no fanfare, no massive treasure, no crowds of grieving officials. A king buried in silence. Or was it a king at all? What funerals meant in Egypt. To understand what was missing, you have to understand what was normal in Egypt. The funeral of a pharaoh was a national event. Even in remote temples, incense was lit. Priests recited the opening of the mouth ritual. Royal family members and courtiers shaved their heads in mourning. Artisans carved elaborate scenes of gods welcoming the king into the afterlife. Sarcophagi were layered stone, clouded wood, nested like matryoshka dolls. Amulets were placed across the body. Scarabs, jade pillars, eyes of Horus. Servants prepared tomb food for decades, ensuring the spirit had nourishment. And above all, names were spoken over and over, because to speak the name of the dead was to keep them alive. But in Amarna, none of this survived. There are no tomb chapels still active. No later inscriptions referencing Akhenaten's funeral. No texts honoring his ka, his soul, his essence. Even his name was scraped off walls. And so, in the most literal sense, his memory was banished. A city of ghosts when Amarna was abandoned. It did not go quietly. Horemheb, the military commander, who became Pharaoh, awarded much of the city's art defaced. The strange, elongated statues of Akhenaten were toppled. The temples of Aten were dismantled. The tomb, far up the wadi, was left to the elements. In later centuries, villagers came to the cliffs to dig for stone. Tomb robbers looked for treasure that didn't exist. Winds pushed sand into the burial halls. Hand animals made their nests in the carved chambers where once gods were invoked. There were rumors that curses lingered in Amarna's hills, that spirits wandered the unfinished tombs, that voices could be heard in the dark. But these were not records. They were fears. History fell quiet, and the tomb waited. What was the afterlife without a path? In Egyptian belief, the journey to the afterlife was not automatic. One needed guidance texts, spells, sacred art. Without these, the soul could be trapped, lost, wandering in the duat, the underworld, unable to reunite with its divine self. Akhenaten's tomb lacked these things. There were no maps, no gods to greet him at the gate, no Osiris to weigh his heart. Instead, there was only Aten, the sun disk, the light, but no directions, and no mourners to light the way. Final thought for this section. What happens when a pharaoh dies and no one wants to remember? When the rituals are skipped, when the name is unspoken, when the tomb is built but never honored. Akhenaten built the city for a god no one else understood. And when he died, he was buried, or perhaps not in a tomb no one tended. He had reshaped Egypt, but in the end, the sand reclaimed his bones, and the silence returned. Yet, we ask, was forgetting him enough to undo what he believed? Or did something of Aten's light remain quiet, buried, waiting? By the time Akhenaten died, Egypt had grown quiet around him. The courtiers no longer sang Aten's hymns quite so loudly. The murals still showed the rays of the sun reaching down in delicate fingers, but those fingers had grown cold. Priests at Karnak, silenced during his reign, were stirring again in Memphis and Thebes, and outside the glinting, strange walls of Amarna's capital city, hastily raised for a god without a face time, was already beginning to move past him. And so, When it came time for the king to be buried, there was hesitation, not in the building of his tomb, not in the carving of long corridors into limestone, but in everything that came after. The rituals, the wrapping, the rites that, for millennia, had guided the king into the afterlife with certainty, because Akhenaten had broken them all, and the ones who remembered how to send a pharaoh properly into the next life had no interest in doing it for him. What a pharaoh's burial usually looked like, a royal burial, was not just a moment of death. It was a state event with layers of preparation, layers of magic, and an entire industry devoted to making sure the pharaoh would not just die, but be reborn. Once the king's body was embalmed in an elaborate process that took 70 days, his funeral procession would pass through temples, escorted by priests, soldiers, and the weeping elite. Canopic jars containing his organs would be sealed in alabaster chests. Priests would perform the opening of the mouth ceremony, an ancient rite to restore speech and breath to the dead. Artisans filled the tomb with scenes of Mythonobis, Horus, Osiris gods, who provided order, judgment, and resurrection. There were offering tables carved in stone, meant to receive food and water for centuries, and long rolls of funerary texts were placed beside the body spells to protect against snakes, fire, drowning, betrayal, or oblivion. But Akhenaten had rejected those gods, and those gods, it seemed, did not return the favor. The priests who stayed silent to one of the most powerful religious bodies in Egypt during this time was the priesthood of Amun, based at Thebes. They had wielded enormous power, both spiritual and economic, for centuries. Akhenaten, early in his reign, had moved swiftly to reduce that power. He shut down temples, redirected funds, and dismantled shrines. He even changed his name from Amenhotep, a man is satisfied, Akhenaten, effective for the Aten. It was not just a rebranding. It was a theological severing. By exalting Aten, the solar disk, Akhenaten had effectively erased Egypt's complex pantheon. This angered not only priests, but scribes, artists, and entire families whose daily lives were intertwined with rituals honoring the old gods. These were not merely mythologies, they were systems of order, meaning, inheritance, and economy. So when Akhenaten died, the priesthood was in no hurry to mourn him. They did not preserve his name on temple walls. They did not speak his prayers. They did not sing his hymns. They let his death fall into a bureaucratic silence. And in Egyptian culture, silence was a kind of death worse than death. The funeral without a song. Some Egyptologists believe Akhenaten may not have received a royal funeral at all. The evidence: no surviving funerary texts, no litany of offerings, no intact tomb painting showing the burial ceremony, not even a clear location of his final interment. His coffin was found broken, its canopic jars shattered, the burial hall itself unfinished, and though some reliefs suggest his daughter Akhenaten was buried in the same tomb, there is no clear record of the entire royal family being honored together in death, in the absence of gods, in the absence of priests, in the absence of a fully functioning religious structure. Akhenaten's burial might have consisted of little more than an attempt to preserve the body, hide the evidence, in hope that no one asked questions later. If there was music, it was lost to time. If there was incense, it burned out quickly. If there were mourners, their names were never carved in stone. Rewriting the end, did Tutankhamun bury his father? One theory gaining traction among historians says that Akhenaten's son, the boy king Tutankhamun, may have attempted to honor his father quietly after his own rise to power. Tutankhamun's reign lasted less than a decade, reversed much of Akhenaten's religious revolution. He restored the temples of Amen. He moved the capital back to Thebes, and he changed his name, removing Aten and reattaching Amen. But evidence suggests that in his early years, he may have still felt loyalty to his father. Could it be that Tutankhamun or his advisors had Akhenaten's remains transferred to the Valley of the Kings? Could that explain the mysterious KV-55 burial, the broken coffin, the gold foil with mismatched names, the canopic jars bearing Akhenaten's mother's name? Was this secret reburial? Not to honor him with grandeur, but simply to put things to rest. If so, it was an act of quiet, repaired too little, too late. The name of Akhenaten would soon be struck from official king lists, his monuments buried, repurposed, or razed. God abandoned. But the question remains, did his own son try, just briefly, to give him the funeral no one else would? A city left without ritual after Akhenaten's death. The city of Amarna crumbled almost overnight. The temples were dismantled. The houses collapsed in neglect. The royal tomb, carved so carefully into the wadi, was left half-done. No stewards remained to maintain the chapel. No lamps were lit for the dead, no. Voice recited the sacred words each morning to keep the spirit alive. In the traditional tombs of other kings at Giza, Saqqara Abido's generations of priests had kept up rituals long after the king was gone. Offerings were renewed. Names were chanted. Memory was preserved, but not in Amarna. Here, forgetting was policy. Akhenaten had built a theology on sunlight, but in death, he was wrapped in darkness, the soul that wandered the ancient. Egyptians believed the soul consisted of multiple parts: the Katha, vital essence; the Batha, mobile personality that could leave the tomb; the Akh, the transfigured spirit achieved through correct burial rites. But all of these depended on proper ritual, on care, on speech, on remembrance. Without these, the soul could wander, stuck in the in-between, neither reborn nor entirely gone. It's a haunting idea, not just metaphysically, but historically, because Akhenaten, for all his reforms, died unprotected. His name unspoken, his gods abandoned, his family scattered, and his memory redacted. What we do with dangerous Akhenaten's crime, the eyes of his successors, was not murder or treason. It was theology. He imagined a different world, one with one God, without idols, where the king alone mediated between the divine and the people. He believed his son Disk did not need myths or stories or anthropomorphic statues, just light. And while this may seem elegant to modern minds, it was deeply destabilizing to the ancient Egyptian world. He did not just revise religion, he attempted to erase what had come before. And so, when the tables turned, his enemies did the same. Erased him, buried him again and again, in silence, an ending without closure even today. We cannot say for certain where Akhenaten's body lies. If the bones in KV-55 are his, they are unmarked, disrespected, and hidden. If his tomb in Amarna once held him, holds only dust now, there is no sarcophagus on display, no funeral stele, no public ceremony marking the day of his death. Only historians quietly piecing together fragments from old reliefs and broken jars. In that way, the erasure was successful. But something remains, because we are still asking questions, still studying the tomb he left behind, still writing his name, and in ancient Egypt, to speak the name of the dead was to bring them back. So now we must ask, what kind of afterlife awaits a king who is remembered only by accident? The tomb was carved in silence, high in the cliffs of the eastern desert, east of the city that had bloomed too fast to reach it. One would have to walk out of Akhenaten, past the dust and the stone chippings, out past the great palace with its roofless colonnades, beyond the house of the charioteer in the Baker's Square, and keep walking toward the mouth of the royal wadi. That wadi, the dry riverbed carved by rains that rarely came twisted like a forgotten God's arm through the hills of Amarna. Some days, the wind would whistle down its path, pulling stray reeds along the floor and lifting pebbles that clinked against the canyon's flanks. It was here, in this silence, that the Pharaoh who dismantled the world had chosen to be buried. But the silence of the place would grow louder after his death. A tomb with no god at the door. Egyptian royal tombs often announced themselves. Even the hidden ones bore traces of name carved in a lintel, a cartouche inscribed near the door, guardian statues placed before the entrance. But the tomb known today as the Amarna royal tomb 26 believed to be Akhenaten's was a space carved but not completed. The descending corridor is long and unadorned, cut directly into pale limestone that flakes in sheets. There is no grand doorway with sacred names, no carved image of the gods to ward off danger. In traditional tombs, gods like Thoth or Anubis guarded the threshold. Here, there was only rock. The builders had begun their work as if in a hurry, maybe spurred by the king's declining health or by the instability of the court. Deep inside the tomb, a side chamber was dug, its ceiling high, its walls oddly plain. This may have been where Akhenaten was placed. Or maybe it was meant for someone else. A burial chamber was started, but never fully finished. A stone sarcophagus, its corners carved with delicate images of Nefertiti, was shattered. The canopic jars that once held internal organs were missing. What had once protected the pharaoh's body had been removed, perhaps violently, perhaps centuries later, perhaps immediately. This was not the end he had planned. The painting that changed everything on one wall, though. There is a painting, faded now, fragmented, but still visible in parts. It shows Akhenaten and Nefertiti standing together beneath the rays of the Aten. Between them lies a small, body-wrapped figure resting on a low bier. This image has haunted scholars for over a century. Who was the child? Was it their daughter, Akhenaten? Was it an infant son? Or was it symbolic, a scene of ritualized death beneath the gaze of a silent sun god? No one knows for certain, but the existence of this mural suggests that, at least for a time, the tomb was active, that mourners came here, that rites were attempted, that, however briefly, the place held grief, and yet the place was never completed. The stairways lead nowhere. The chambers echo with their own emptiness. No priest returned hereafter. The royal family fled Amarna. No offering was recorded. No annual rite of renewal was performed. Only sand returned slowly, quietly, drifting in from the entrance to settle over the past. What happens when memory is erased in the ancient Egyptian worldview? Memory was protection. The name Ren was the part of the soul that allowed one to live on. Names were carved in temples, spoken in rituals, preserved on walls and statues. If a name was forgotten, the soul was believed to fade. So, when Akhenaten's successors ordered his name removed, it wasn't just an act of revenge. It was a spiritual annihilation. His cartouches were chiseled out, his monuments dismantled. Even the hieroglyph for Aten was avoided in later texts, as if its very shape carried danger. In tombs of later pharaohs, scenes of Akhenaten's reign were deliberately excluded. The kings that came after him, Smenkhare, Tutankhamen, I, or Amhebi, erased or ignored his existence. It wasn't until centuries later, the 19th century CE, that his name would be spoken again. The rediscovery that wasn't meant to happen in the 1800s, when European archaeologists began uncovering Amarna. They expected a little dot. It was just a scattering of strange buildings in the desert. But soon, fragments of a forgotten city began to emerge, buildings laid out in odd lines, courtyards with sun altars, inscriptions dedicated not to Amen or Osiris, but to a nameless sun disk. And then came the tomb. Discovered in 1891, the Amarna royal tomb was badly damaged. The sarcophagus had been smashed, the burial chamber stripped, but clues remained: a few traces of pigment, a few lines of hieroglyphs. For decades, Egyptologists debated, was this Akhenaten's final resting place? Later, when KV-55 was found in the Valley of the Kings with its mismatched burial artifacts, and its erased name debates grew fiercer, some argued that his body had been moved. Others, that he had never been buried properly at all. To this day, the mystery remains, which is his real tomb, and who made the decision to leave it incomplete. The man who was left behind. The tragic irony is that Akhenaten, who tried to unify Egypt under a single god, died divided in memory, divided in burial, divided in history. He left behind no great line of successors. His children either died young or were absorbed into the courts of more traditional kings. His god faded. His city crumbled. His name was scratched out. Yet fragments of his dream survived in the quiet walls of his tomb, in the awkward architecture of a Marne, in the mystery of a painting showing a family in grief beneath a sun that no longer warmed them. Akhenaten had tried to bring clarity to Egypt, simplicity, oneness, but his death brought only confusion. The final absence. When we picture royal tombs, we imagine golden masks, painted ceilings, storerooms packed with goods for the afterlife. But in Akhenaten's case, we're left with absence. No mask, no mummy, no intact burial chamber, just a carved tomb in a desert gorge. A few scraps of painted plaster, in the long shadow of a reign that no one wanted to remember. Perhaps that was his punishment, or perhaps it was the price of revolution, because Akhenaten was not simply a heretic. He was a man who believed in something utterly different from his world. He believed that the divine could be impersonal, abstract, formless. He believed that ritual could be replaced by light. He believed in the power of silence. And, in the end, silence claimed him. A tomb that speaks without words today. If you walk the hills above Amarna, you can still find the entrance. To the tomb, it's quiet. No tourists come often. The air is dry, the lights sharp. Inside, the walls are bare, the stone cool. There are no treasures here, only space. Only the long, empty corridors of a man who thought he could change everything and who was, in turn, erased. And yet, the tomb still exists. His name is still spoken, and the questions he raised about belief, about tradition, about the power of memory still echo in the chambers of that unfinished place. You might ask, can a tomb without mourners still hold meaning? And if so, what else might survive when the world tries to forget? In ancient Egypt, to strike a name was not just to remove it from stone, it was to unmake a life. The chisel did not merely break rock, it broke continuity. It interrupted breath, In a world where survival beyond death required memory, acknowledgement, and inscription. To erase a name was to deny eternity, and someone at some moment after Akhenaten's death decided that his name must never again be spoken aloud. This story is about the people who made that choice. Not just one man with a chisel, but a system of scribes, priests, sculptors, overseers. Men who once served a king who called himself the son of the Aten. Men who once carved his praises in gold and granite, then quietly began to undo their own work. Not overnight, not in one wave, but stroke by stroke, bit by bit, sand by sand, until a name that had filled a city vanished from the public record, and all that remained was silence. The scribes who turned their pens around at the heart of Egyptian temple life was a small, quiet figure. The scribe, in neat lines, he copied sacred texts, royal decrees, household records, tax rolls, inventories. He was a man of symbols, of careful repetition, of obedience to the pen. During Akhenaten's reign, these men had to rewrite everything. The names of gods changed. Rituals were altered. The word Aten, once a minor sun symbol, was elevated. Amen was erased, then replaced, then spoken of again, only in whispers. Every scribe in Thebes and Memphis and Heliopolis knew the consequences of getting it wrong. But when Akhenaten died, the court began its uncertain shift back to orthodoxy. The scribes had to pivot again. They did not rebel. They simply began to omit. They wrote prayers without the Aten. They replaced Akhenaten's name with that enemy. In temple scrolls, they left spaces where his titles used to be. In some copies, they inked over his name. In others, they inserted new lines, substituting references to the pharaoh's father with more neutral phrasing, a previous ruler. It was a bureaucratic unraveling. And, like all bureaucracies, it moved slowly, quietly, without announcement, but the intent was clear. To undo Akhenaten's place in the cosmic order. The sculptors who picked up the chisel again erasure was not just a matter of paper and ink. Stone had to be recarved across Egypt. Statues of Akhenaten had been raised in courtyards, set in niches, placed before the altars of his sun temples. He had authorized thousands of them, more than any king before him, and now they had to be destroyed. But not always completely. Sometimes a face was defaced, but the body left intact. Sometimes the names were chiseled out, but the inscriptions left readable. Sometimes a whole relief was carved over new gods, etched atop the old ones. The image of Aten, once rendered with outstretched rays ending in hands, was dulled, softened, buried under new scenes. The sculptors knew what they were doing. They had, after all, carved those faces once. Now they removed them. In some temples, especially those later reclaimed by Ramses or Seti, you can see the ghost images palimpsests, where one king's image bleeds faintly beneath another's. Akhenaten's legacy, buried but not quite gone, still lingers in the stone beneath the later pharaohs. Glory. The chisel had tried to forget him, but the stone remembered. The priests who had waited while Akhenaten reigned. The priesthood of Ammon had been cast aside. Their temples shuddered. Dare. Income revoked. Akhenaten had not just introduced a new god, he had attempted to dismantle an entire religious system that had governed Egypt for centuries. He dismissed or ignored the temples of Mut, Osiris, Thoth, Ptah. He centralized offerings through the Aten cult, and, by doing so, removed the spiritual livelihood of Egypt's old elite. But priests are patient, and their rituals are older than kings. When Akhenaten died, Tankhaten, soon to become Tutankhamun, came to the throne as a child. The priests returned. They brought back Amun. They reopened the temples. They guided the boy king into renaming himself, replacing the syllable Aten in his name with Amen, a symbol, but a powerful one. And behind the temple walls, in quiet rooms thick with incense and whispers, they began to revise the records. Akhenaten had been a disturbance. Now he would be recast as an error, not formally condemned not yet, but quietly excluded from the king lists, its monuments dismantled or buried, its image scratched out in temple reliefs. The priests had lost power once. They would not lose it again, and so they made sure no one would ever try what he had tried. The cartouches. There were Kade. Pharaoh's name was his armor, written inside an oval, called a cartouche. It was supposed to be protected from tampering. Sacred, permanent. Akhenaten's cartouches were different. He had several names: Nafakipa, Winra, Akhenaten. He also had official titles: Son of the Sun Disk, Beloved of Aten, Chosen by the Sun. These were etched into stele. Doorways, temple pylons, border markers, and almost all of them were later desecrated. Some were hacked with haste dragged, uneven lines that barely obscured the glyphs. Others were more carefully effaced, polished, smooth, as if to suggest nothing had ever been there. But every time the chisel struck, Keith, a political truth, that Akhenaten had become dangerous, even in memory. His name, too, tied to a controversial reign, to link to a god that no longer had worshippers, could not be left in stone. And so it was struck again and again, until even his successors barely spoke it. The workmen who closed the door in Amarna, the laborers who once served the city, were eventually ordered to leave. Their homes, small, rectangular dwellings clustered in ordered rows, were abandoned. The storage jars left half-filled, the tools buried under sand. The city was not dismantled. It was simply left behind, and before they departed, someone sealed the tombs, the royal tomb, the nobles' tombs, even the unfinished burial shafts. They closed the door on a chapter no one wanted to remember, and when the desert crept back over the stones, the names were buried with them. But one wonders, what did those scribes think as they omitted the name? What did those sculptors feel as they chipped away the face they once honored? Did the priests in their candlelit sanctuaries ever speak his name in private whisper to each other, still tinged with fear? And did the chisel, as it struck, ever hesitate? If the name of Akhenaten had simply vanished, like the footprints of a man in sand swept by wind, it would be one kind of forgetting. But his name did not vanish. It was buried, and that is a different kind of silence altogether. Burial is a choice. Burial is deliberate. Burial implies both remembrance and refusal. When the people of Egypt chose to erase Akhenaten, they did not do so without remembering him first. They did not allow him to fade gently. They pressed him down into rock, into sand, into secrecy. And they did it twice, the burial and the king. Lists. The Egyptians kept lists of kings, not only as records of reigns, but as spiritual documents. These lists, carved into temple walls or inscribed on papyri, affirmed the divine continuity of rule. They told the story not just of government, but of cosmic order. Akhenaten's name was left off of almost all of them in the Apatous King list commissioned by Seti. There is no mention of Akhenaten. The list skips from Amenhotep III to Tutankhamun. Still, nothing had happened in between. Likewise, in the Saqqara list and the Turin canon, Akhenaten is absent. Even when scribes later tried to include him in retrospective documents, they did so cautiously, with hesitation in their tone and ambiguity in their phrasing. It is as if they knew he had ruled, or were uncertain how to explain him. He had not been a usurper. He had not lost a war. He had not been overthrown. He had simply become unacceptable. So instead of recording him, they left a space shaped like a name, but silent. The rewriting of royal memory. To understand why Akhenaten was erased, you must understand the power of royal narrative in ancient Egypt. Pharaohs did not just rule, they curated history. Each king aligned himself with the gods, the seasons, the Nile, the harvest. And when a king died, it was expected that his memory would be preserved in monuments and festivals, statues and stelae. But Akhenaten's successors had a different task, not to preserve, but to overwrite. When Tutankhamun came to power, still a child, his advisors, many of whom had served under Akhenaten, initiated a campaign of reversal. The capital was moved back to Thebes. The name of Amen was reinstated. The temples reopened. Even the boy's own name was changed. From Tutankhaten to Tutankhamina, visible symbol of religious correction. Every action, every decree seemed to whisper a single message. Forget by the time Horemheb, general with no royal blood, became Pharaoh. The revision of history was nearly complete. He issued proclamations condemning previous administrations without naming Akhenaten directly. He rebuilt temples that had been neglected. He styled himself as a restorer of a Dora man, cleaning up a quiet disaster. But the disaster was not military or economic. It was theological. Akhenaten's revolution had been spiritual, and so his punishment was to dot the sand that covered. Amarna, the city built by Akhenaten, was meant to be eternal. Its foundations were set in virgin soil, far from the reach of old gods. Its temples were aligned with the sun. Stone-carved boundaries steely declared divine permanence. It had schools, workshops, libraries, storerooms, royal residences. But Amarna's eternity lasted only a generation. When Akhenaten died, the court abandoned the city. The young Tutankhamun spent little time there. Taramab never visited. The place remained inhabited by a few artisans and priests for a while, those who had nowhere else to go. But slowly, steadily, it emptied. The roofs collapsed. The plaster peeled. The sun scorched what remained. And then the sand began to drift in. It took decades, but the city eventually vanished beneath layers of silence. What could not be chiseled away was buried. Amarna became a ghost town without ghosts. The very site of a theological dream turned into a forgotten ditch in the desert. And still, the name of the man who had built it remained unwelcome. The stones. That spoke later, despite the thoroughness of the erasure. History has a habit of leaving clues. Some of Akhenaten's statues were repurposed, turned sideways, buried beneath newer constructions, or reused in foundation walls. Temple inscriptions, poorly chiseled over, still bore traces of his name when examined in slanting light. And in the tombs of Amarna, carved high into cliffs, the outlines of his face and the sun disk of Aten could not be completely destroyed without destabilizing the rock. Archaeologists, centuries later, would piece together these ghost remnants. One of the first to do so was a Prussian explorer named Carl Richard Lepsius in the 19th century. As he copied inscriptions from the tombs, he noted strange names and unfamiliar patterns, remnants of a king who did not appear in the official records. Later, Blenders Petrie, working at Amarna, would uncover an entire city buried under dust kilns, roads, homes, even graffiti scrawled on house walls. One piece read simply, "The living Aten." The erasure had failed. The past was louder than the chisel. The quiet persistence of a naming Egyptian belief. To speak the name of the dead was to give them life. Akhenaten's enemies believed that by silencing his name, they could end him twice, first in life, bent in eternity. But they underestimated the stubbornness of stone. They underestimated time, and they underestimated the scribes who recorded everything, even the things they were told not to. We know Akhenaten's name today because enough was left fragments, traces, flinches in the record. We know it because the act of erasure left outlines. We know it because what is buried can be uncovered, even if it takes 3,000 years. But there remains a question. Who gave the order? Was it a priest embittered by the suppression of his god? Was it a scribe obeying new instructions? Was it Horemheb seeking legitimacy? Or was it Egypt itself recoiling from an experiment that felt like heresy? No document survives with the words, "Erase him." And perhaps none was ever written. Perhaps it was understood, an unspoken decree, carried on the wind between temples and palaces, a silence that became a sentence, and a sentence that buried a king. There is a strange thing that happens when a name is erased, not gently forgotten, but actively chiseled out. It becomes louder. Akhenaten's name, once a centerpiece of royal declarations and sunlit hymns, had been struck from stele, erased from lists, and sanded from statues. But in doing so, his erasers had drawn a red circle around the silence. For archaeologists and historians, for those who came long after the wind had worn down the walls of Amarna, it became a mystery worth solving. And mysteries, as it turns out, live longer than memory. The archaeologists who found what was meant to stay lost the 19th century in Egypt was a time of impatient hands. European expeditions, some funded by governments and others by private collectors, tore through. sand and time with a hunger for treasures and secrets. They took crates of artifacts, copied inscriptions, broke into sealed tombs. But among these hurried seekers were also those who paused to listen. In 1891, Flinders Petrie began his meticulous excavation of the ruins of Amarna. He wasn't chasing golden masks or gemstone-encrusted scepters. He cataloged pottery shards, marked out foundations, and, most importantly, took careful notes. He found a city-one, planned on a grid, built quickly, and abandoned just as fast in the rubble of workshops. Found stencils bearing the shape of the autumn rays of sun, ending in hands, in discarded refuse pits, fragments of statues, and painted walls. But what startled him most was the sheer silence in the records about the man who had built it. The city had been lost, yes, but it had also been hidden. Every brick said Akhenaten. Every doorway hummed with the memory of a theological revolution. And yet, his name was missing from every formal text. The memory hidden in language of Anne as the state tried to erase him. The people remembered. Somewhere in the outer walls of a worker's tomb, someone once scratched the name Akhenaten using casual, unmonumental hieratic script. It wasn't a priest or a royal scribe, just a worker, maybe a stonecutter, maybe someone who had lived through the last years of the city and hadn't left when the court returned to Thebes. That name, scratched without flourish, speaks volumes, because in Egypt, names were not just labels, they were power. They anchored a soul in the afterlife. To name something was to affirm its place in the cosmos. The erasure of Akhenaten was supposed to sever that tether. But this little scrawl, half buried and sun-bleached, was a tether re-tied. It meant someone had remembered. Someone had spoken his name again. And that was all it took. The statues that refused to disappear after the collapse of Akhenaten's regime. Statues of the heretic king were smashed, beheaded, and dumped into pits. In Karnak and Luxor, great pylons were rebuilt using pieces of dismantled Akhenaten-era monuments. Sometimes, these blocks were hidden inside walls like bones in a foundation. But that act, too, preserved them. In trying to erase him, his successors had hidden his face inside their own monuments. When those monuments decayed, his face returned in the 20th century. Archaeologists began finding these talatat blocks, small limestone pieces, used in Akhenaten's building projects in the foundations of later temples. Piece by piece, these were reconstructed into murals, revealing scenes of daily life in Amarna, worship of the Eton, in royal processions led by Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Imagine that, a king erased from memory, but whose face reappears centuries later inside the walls of those who sought to destroy him. Time does not play favorites. It simply waits. The modern controversy, Pharaoh or prophet. By the mid-20th century, Akhenaten had become a fascination, not just for Egyptologists, but for philosophers, theologians, theologians. Sigmund Freud famously theorized, controversially, that Moses had been a follower of Akhenaten, and that monotheism itself might have been born not in the deserts of Sinai, but in the temples of Amarna. Freud's ideas were speculative and heavily debated, but they reflected a deeper curiosity that still lingers. Why did Akhenaten turn against the gods of his ancestors? Was it a genuine spiritual vision? A calculated political move to centralize power under the royal family by dismantling the influential priesthood of Amen? Was it a reaction to corruption, a kind of theological rebellion, or something more personal? We may never know. What we do know is that his erasure was not a final verdict. It was a pause in the sentence of Historia, not a period. The irony of immortality in Egyptian belief. There were 3 ways to live on after death. First, your body had to be preserved. Second, your name had to be spoken. Third, your story had to be told. Akhenaten's body was hidden, possibly moved from Amarna to the Valley of the Kings in Tomb KV 55, where his remains, now heavily debated, were found, desecrated and disturbed. His name was struck out, his monuments ruined, but his story, it could not be stopped. Modern museums now display his likeness. Scholars write monographs about his reforms. Artists and filmmakers evoke his memory. He is debated in academic halls and whispered about in theological essays. He has become, in some strange way, mortal, and not in the way his erasers intended. The quiet chisel of time, perhaps the most powerful tool in history, is not the hammer. It is the chisel, not the one that breaks, but the one that carves. Whoever first took a chisel to Akhenaten's name was not destroying a tyrant. They were trying to protect something, perhaps Egypt's religious traditions, perhaps political continuity, perhaps their own future. But time chisels too. It wears down the facades, cuts through the concealments, exposes the seams. Time has a strange loyalty to the overlooked. It does not always reveal what we hope. It often reveals what we feared. And so, what remains of Akhenaten is not the record he wrote for himself, nor the silence that followed him, but the echo that emerged centuries later, when the sand was brushed away and the sun hit carved stone, the echo of a forgotten voice that was never truly gone, a memory, first erased with a hammer, and then remembered with a whisper. Final reflection: when we think of the past, we imagine stories told in full, names remembered, deeds listed, monuments preserved. But just as often, history is shaped by silence. The gaps between records, the absences in stone, the blank spaces on king lists, and the half-erased glyphs on walls. Akhenat's story is not just the story of a revolutionary or a heretic or a philosopher king. It is the story of what happens when a society decides that one chapter of its own history must not be told, and what happens when time, ever patient, tells it anyway.